Evelyn Clarke drove that axe into the earth with both hands shaking, not from weakness, but from 3 days without a full meal and a fury she had nowhere else to put. The cabin wasn't finished. The summer was brutal, and every man in Harlan Creek had turned his back on her like she was something shameful to be forgotten. She didn't cry. She swung. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow it to the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 arrived in Harlan Creek, Montana like a punishment, the kind of heat that pressed down on a person's chest and made every breath feel like labor. Dust hung in the air for hours after a horse passed through, and the creek itself had thinned to a trickle that barely covered the rocks. The cattle ranchers liked the season well enough. The farmers cursed it every morning, and Evelyn Clarke, whom most of the town had taken to calling "that woman on the ridge," simply endured it because endurance was the only language she had left. She had arrived in Harlan Creek 11 weeks earlier, in the last week of April, with a wagon and mule, a deed to 40 acres of land in her dead husband's name, and not one single person expecting her. Thomas Clarke had purchased the land 2 years before his death. A fever had taken him in the spring of '72. Quick and merciless, the way fevers often did. He'd described the land in letters to Evie as a place where they could start clean. Build something. Be something. She had believed him the way a woman believes a man she loves, which is to say, completely and without condition. What Thomas hadn't told her, or perhaps hadn't known, was that Lawrence Donovan already had plans for those 40 acres. And in Harlan Creek, what Lawrence Donovan wanted Lawrence Donovan had a habit of getting. Evie had known none of that when she arrived. She'd only known the deed was legal, the land was hers, and she had enough lumber in that wagon to begin framing the foundation of the cabin Thomas had sketched out on the back of an envelope. She got to work the next morning. Willard Mercer first saw her on a Tuesday. He wasn't looking for her. He wasn't looking for anything. He'd ridden that ridge trail every morning for the past 14 months, as a kind of discipline, a way to move through the world without actually being in it. His horse, a gray quarter horse named Greer, knew the path so well that Will barely had to hold the reins. He had been a rancher once, in the full sense of the word. A man with land cattle, a wife, and a future. Margaret had died in the spring of 1873, a difficult childbirth that took her and the baby both, and what remained of Will Mercer. After that wasn't so much a man as it was the outline of one. He still fed the cattle. He still paid his hands. He still nodded at people in town when he rode through. He just didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, he kept it short. He was 41 years old and felt considerably older. That Tuesday morning, he came around the bend on the ridge trail and pulled Greer to a stop. Down in the clearing below the old Chandler parcel vacant for years, a woman was working. Not the gentle background kind of working that people did in the distance. Real, full-bodied committed labor. She had a log balanced on a pair of sawhorses and was running a hand plane along its surface with long, deliberate strokes. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Her dark hair was pinned up, but coming loose in the heat. There was a bandage wrapped around her left hand. Will watched for longer than he intended to. She didn't look up. She didn't seem to notice him, or if she did, she didn't care. She finished the log, marked it with chalk, moved to the next one. No hesitation, no rest. He rode on. But the next morning he slowed at the same bend without deciding to, and she was there again. Earlier than him this time. She had a frame partially assembled rough timber posts set into the ground, and she was attempting to raise a crossbeam alone, bracing it with her shoulder and driving a spike with her free hand. It slipped. The beam crashed sideways into the dirt. She stood still for a moment. Then she crouched, lifted one end, and started again. Will Mercer turned Greer away from the ridge and rode down the other side. He heard about her in town 3 days later. He hadn't gone looking for information. He'd gone to the feed store, and the feed store in Harlan Creek was where information went whether you wanted it or not. Opal Richardson was behind the counter when he walked in. Opal, who had run the store since her husband passed a decade ago, who knew the name and business of every soul within 30 miles, and who possessed the rare combination of sharp opinion and selective mercy. She was ringing up a bag of oat feed for a rancher named Curtis Pell when Will pushed through the door. "That woman on the Chandler place," Curtis was saying, shaking his head. "Building a cabin alone, did you hear, widow? No family. Says she has a deed." "I heard," Opal said, not looking up from the register. "Larry Donovan says that deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on. Says Thomas Clarke never finalized the purchase, something about a missed payment before he died." Curtis scratched the back of his neck. "Town council's taking it up next month." Meanwhile, she's up there hammering logs together like she doesn't know any better." He laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "Somebody ought to tell her to save her energy." "Somebody ought to mind their own concern," Opal said, and handed him his receipt. Curtis left. Will set his feed order on the counter. Opal looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for men who pretended not to be listening. "You rode past the Chandler parcel this week." "Just passing through." She wrote up his order. "Her name is Evelyn Clarke, goes by Evie. She's been at it since April, alone. Nobody in this town has offered her a lick of help." She paused. "You planning to keep just passing through?" Will took his receipt and said nothing. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that for 4 more days, right up until the afternoon, he was riding back from the eastern fence line and heard the sound of a voice. A single controlled, furious voice, and the crack of something hitting wood, and something in his chest decided the conversation was over. He turned Greer toward the ridge. Evie Clarke was standing in the clearing with a hammer at her side, and Lawrence Donovan 20 feet in front of her, flanked by 2 men Will recognized as hands from Donovan's ranch. Donovan was a broad, well-dressed man with gray at his temples and the easy posture of someone who had never once been told no and made to stick with it. "I'm not asking you to surrender anything," Donovan was saying, his voice smooth and reasonable. "I'm asking you to be practical. The cabin's not finished, not by the county's definition, which means under territorial law the claim lapses. All I'm offering is a fair price for your time and trouble before this gets unpleasant." "It's already unpleasant," Evie said. "Mrs. Clarke, the deed is registered with the territorial court. My husband's attorney filed it in January of 1872. 2 witnesses, both of whose names I can produce." Her voice was flat and controlled, the kind of flat that came from a person suppressing something enormous. "I don't know what story you've been telling around town, Mr. Donovan, but it doesn't match the paperwork, and the paperwork is what a judge will look at." "A judge is a long ride from here," Donovan said, and his smile didn't change. "And winter comes early in this territory." "It's July." "That's my point." Will rode into the clearing at a walk and pulled Greer up between Evie and the 3 men. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't raise his voice. He just stopped there and looked at Donovan with the particular expression of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "Will Mercer," Donovan said after a moment. "Didn't know you had business up here. Heard some talk that needed settling." Donovan's eyes moved to Evie, then back to Will. Something shifted behind them, slight and quick, the way a man's calculations shift when the odds change. "This doesn't concern you." "You're on someone else's land," Will said. "That concerns the land's owner. She's standing right there." He glanced at the 2 ranch hands. "You boys planning to stay?" They looked at Donovan. Donovan adjusted his hat. The smile came back, but it had edges now. "We're not finished, Mrs. Clarke." "Yes," Evie said. "You are." The 3 men rode away. Evie waited until the sound of their horses faded. Then she turned to look at Will Mercer with an expression that was not gratitude. "I didn't ask for your help," she said. "No, ma'am. I had the situation handled." "You did?" he agreed. She studied him. He was still on horseback, hadn't dismounted, which she noticed. He was giving her space. Big man, weathered face. Dark eyes that had been through something and hadn't quite come out the other side. His clothes were working clothes, not display. He held the reins loose. "Then why are you still here?" she asked. Will thought about that for a moment. "Seemed rude to leave before you told me to." Evie looked at him for another long beat. Then she turned back to the half-built frame of her cabin and picked up her hammer. "You can go," she said. He went. But the next morning he came back. He dismounted this time, and he stood at the edge of the clearing with his hat in his hand, which was a gesture that meant something in 1874, even if neither of them said so. "I'd like to help," he said, "if you'll allow it." Evie didn't look up from the log she was marking. "Why?" "Because I've got time, and you've got a frame that's going to shift in the next hard wind if you don't get a diagonal brace on it." She looked up then, looked at the frame, and then back at him. Her jaw tightened, which he read not as anger, but as pride measuring itself against practicality. "2 hours," she said. "You help with the brace, then you go." "Yes, ma'am." He worked. She worked. For 2 hours, neither of them said much, just the short, functional language of people doing physical labor together. "Hand this. Hold that. A little left. Good." She knew what she was doing, he realized. More than he'd expected. She wasn't learning as she went. She had a plan specific and deliberate, and she was executing it with the focused efficiency of a woman who had thought about it for a long time before she started. When the brace was set and secured, he stepped back and picked up his hat. "That'll hold," he said. "I know," she said. Then, after a pause that felt like it cost her something, "Thank you." He nodded once and left. He came back the following morning. She didn't tell him to leave. That became the arrangement, though neither of them named it. He arrived early, worked through the morning hours, and left before midday. She fed him nothing, and offered nothing, and he asked for nothing. And somehow that mutual understanding of terms made both of them more comfortable than if it had been negotiated out loud. On the 4th morning, she spoke first. "You're the mercer who lost his wife last year." He didn't stop working. "Word travels. Harlan Creek's a small town." She was fitting a door frame holding one side while driving a pin. "I'm sorry. For your loss." "Thank you." A pause. "I lost mine 2 years ago. Thomas. Fever." "I heard." He passed her the next pin. "I'm sorry, too." "He's the reason I'm here," she said. "He bought this land, wanted us to build something on it." She drove the pin home. "I intend to." Will looked at the frame around them. Rough timber and raw wood, and the smell of sawdust in the summer heat, and said, "It's going to be a solid cabin." "It already is," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. The trouble found them on a Thursday, 10 days after Will first rode into the clearing. He was cutting shingles at the far end of the lot when he heard the wagon coming, not one wagon, 3, and the voice of Opal Richardson calling Evie's name from the road. He set down his draw knife and walked over. Opal was on the lead wagon dressed in her good blouse, which meant this was official. Behind her were 6 other women from town and 3 of their husbands and the town's one preacher, who looked like he'd been brought along as moral weight. "Evelyn Clarke," Opal said, "I have come to tell you something that you need to hear plainly, and I'd like you to listen before you say a word." Evie crossed her arms. "Go ahead. Lawrence Donovan has petitioned the town council to assess your property claim based on the territorial completion statute. Which means, if this cabin isn't livably complete by the 1st of September, he has grounds to contest your deed before the circuit judge, and in this territory, the circuit judge happens to owe Lawrence Donovan 3 favors. Opal said it without drama, just facts lined up like ammunition. "You have 8 weeks. Evie's jaw didn't move. "That's why I'm here," Opal continued. "And why these good people are here. I will not watch Lawrence Donovan steal a widow's land in plain sight while this town stands around looking at its boots." She climbed down from the wagon and smoothed her skirt. "So, what do you need done first?" Something shifted in Evie's face so small that most people would have missed it. Will saw it. He'd been watching her for 10 days, and he had learned to read the small things. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something more complicated, like a wall taking the first deliberate crack. "The roof framing," Evie said. "That's the longest part." "Then we start there," Opal said. The group spread out across the lot with the efficient energy of people who had decided on a thing. Evie moved to meet them, directing a signing, showing them what Thomas had drawn on the back of that envelope, like it was a blueprint she'd memorized years ago. Will stayed where he was for a moment, watching her move through the crowd. This woman who had come to a strange town with nothing but a deed and a dead man's dream, who had swung an axe in the summer heat for 11 weeks, without asking a single soul for a single thing. He picked up his draw knife and went back to work. It was near dusk when Opal found him at the shingle pile, everyone else packing up to leave. "You've been here a while," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Opal looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been watching people her entire life and had stopped being surprised by very little. "She's a good woman, Will. I can see that. Can you see anything else?" He kept cutting the shingle. "I'm just helping with the cabin, Opal." She made a sound that was not agreement. "Mm-hmm." She started back toward the wagons, then paused. "She trusts actions, not words. Keep that in mind." He didn't answer, but he held on to it. That evening, when it was just the two of them left as it had been the past 10 days, Evie sat down on the tailgate of her wagon and drank water from a tin cup and looked at the work they'd done. The roof frame was 30% set. Real progress, visible progress. 8 weeks, she said, not to him, but to the structure. "Plenty of time," Will said. She looked at him. "You don't have to keep coming back." "I know. I mean it. You've done more than anyone had a right to expect from a stranger." He settled on a stack of lumber across from her. In the long evening light, with the Montana summer going golden around them, and the sound of the creek below the ridge, he looked like what he was, a tired man who had been through something and was only now slowly finding his way back to the surface. "I don't sleep much," he said. "Never know what to do with the mornings." She looked at him a long time. "Margaret," she said. "Yeah." Evie turned the tin cup in her hands. "For a long time after Thomas died, I'd wake up and reach for him before I was fully awake. It'd take me a second to remember." She paused. "I hated those seconds. And then I hated that I stopped having them." Will said nothing, but something in his posture changed, a loosening barely visible in his shoulders. "Grief does strange things to time," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "It does." They sat in the quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. Then Evie stood and set her cup on the wagon and looked at him with those direct, measuring eyes. "Same time tomorrow." "Same time tomorrow," Will said. She went to her tent. She was sleeping in a canvas tent beside the worksite until the cabin was livable. He watched her go, and then he looked at the half-built frame against the evening sky, and something that had been locked tight in his chest for 14 months shifted an inch. Just an inch. But it was something. What neither of them knew, what Will would not discover for another week, and Evie would not discover until it was almost too late, was that Lawrence Donovan had not gone to the town council to file a legal petition. He had gone to 3 different men. Men who did not work in daylight. Men who charged by the night. And those men were already in Harlan Creek waiting. The 3 men Donovan had hired were not the kind who announced themselves. They didn't drink in the saloon or stable their horses at the public livery. They came in quiet, took a room above the tannery at the edge of town from a landlord who asked no questions, and they waited for instructions. The way men in their line of work always waited patiently and without conscience. Their names didn't matter. What mattered was what they were paid to do. The first sign came on a Friday night, 9 days after Opal and the town women had shown up at the clearing. Evie woke at 2 in the morning to Greer making noise on the ridge trail. Will's horse didn't sleep as quietly as most, and then to something else. A sound from the worksite. A sound that wasn't wind and wasn't animal. She was out of her tent in seconds, rifle in hand, boots not yet laced. The roof, framing 3 days of work, the work of 12 people across 2 long sessions, was on the ground. Not collapsed. Taken down. Deliberately, methodically disassembled, and dropped, the bracing pins removed and scattered, the crossbeams knocked off their posts and left in the dirt like something discarded. Evie stood in the dark and looked at it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood very still and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way she had taught herself to breathe when Thomas died. And the world had gone sideways, and she couldn't afford to fall apart because there was no one there to catch her. Then she picked up the nearest beam, dragged it back to its position, and started counting pins by feel in the dark. She worked until the sky went gray. Will arrived at first light and stopped cold at the edge of the clearing. He took in what had happened in one long, quiet look. Then he looked at Evie still working, moving with the rigid efficiency of someone running entirely on anger and will, and he set down his tools and walked over to her without a word, and picked up the other end of the beam she was struggling to lift. They reset the frame together in silence. When the last pin was back in place, Evie sat down on the ground with her hands on her knees and her head bowed, and Will crouched beside her and waited. "This wasn't weather," she said. "No." "This was a message." "Yes." She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but the skin around them was tight and dark from a night without sleep. "He wants me to quit." "He does." "I'm not going to." Will looked at her steadily. "I know." She stood, brushed the dirt off her hands, and went to get her hammer. He watched her go, and then he made a decision he hadn't planned on making that morning. He rode into town. He found Opal Richardson at the feed store before it opened, taking inventory in the back. "Donovan's hired men," he said without preamble. "They tore down Evie's roof frame last night, every bit of it. She had it back up by morning, but they'll do it again." Opal set down her ledger. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went very cold. "You're certain it was hired men? I'm certain it wasn't wind." She was quiet for a moment. "Lawrence Donovan has been maneuvering for that parcel since before Evelyn Clarke ever heard of Harlan Creek. He wants the ridge access. The creek below runs through her land, only clean water source on that entire eastern face, worth more than the cabin, more than the 40 acres. She folded her hands. He won't stop with torn-down framing. What will he do next? Whatever it takes. She looked at him with the direct, clear gaze of a woman who had survived enough to know where threats ended. "The question is, what you're going to do, Will Mercer?" He didn't answer that directly. "She needs someone watching the site at night. I can arrange that. Tom Hadley and his boys have been wanting a reason to cross Donovan for 2 years. He undercut Tom's cattle price last fall, and that's not the kind of thing a man forgets." She paused. "But that's a short-term solution. The legal problem is still coming. September 1st. "I know. You planning to be there for that part, too?" He picked up his hat from the counter. "I'll be at the site." Opal watched him walk to the door. "Will," she called. He turned. "She's not Margaret," Opal said. Not unkindly, just plainly the way she did everything. "But I think you already know that." He held the door for a moment, and then he left without answering. Which was, she decided, an answer of its own. He told Evie that evening the full of it. Donovan's motivation, the creek access, the legal strategy, the September deadline, all of it laid out without softening. She listened without interrupting. That was one of the things he had come to understand about her in these weeks. She didn't fill silence with noise the way some people did. She let information land and settle before she responded. "The creek," she said. "Yes, Thomas mentioned it. In his letters, said it was the best feature of the land." Her jaw moved. He didn't know Donovan had claims on it. Donovan never filed claims. He just assumed no one would challenge him. And then I showed up. And then you showed up. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the cousin of one sharp and without humor. I bet that made his day. I'd imagine not. She was quiet again for a moment. Then, what happens if the cabin isn't done by September? The council rules the claim lapsed. Donovan's attorney petitions the circuit judge. Judge is sympathetic. You lose the land. And if it is done? Donovan's petition fails. Your deed stands. He'd have to challenge it in territorial court, which is a 2-year fight in the open with witnesses and documentation, which is a fight he won't want if the town is watching. She turned that over. So everything depends on September 1st. Yes. She stood up and walked to the cabin frame, solid now, reset holding, and put her hand on the nearest post. He watched her stand there, this woman with her bandaged hand, and her dead husband's dream, and her absolute refusal to be moved. We need to go faster, she said. We will, he said. The next morning, Tom Hadley arrived with his 2 oldest boys, neither of whom was under 25, both of whom were larger than most obstacles. They set up a rotation, 2 people on the site from sundown to sunrise, trading off in 4-hour shifts. Tom took the first night himself, rifle across his knees, and sat in the dark with the easy patience of a man who'd been waiting 2 years for a reason. Nothing happened that night, or the next. But on the 3rd night, one of Tom's boys, the younger one, a broad-shouldered young man named Ellis, heard movement on the south side of the lot, and stepped out to meet it, and came face to face with one of Donovan's hired men holding a long-handled axe. The 2 of them looked at each other for a long moment in the dark. You want to reconsider, Ellis said, what you're about to do with that. The man turned around and walked away into the dark. Ellis told Will about it the next morning, and Will told Evie, and Evie set her jaw and said, Tell Ellis thank you, and went back to work. The cabin took shape in the weeks that followed with a kind of desperate momentum. People came who hadn't been there at the start. Ranchers' wives who had heard what Donovan was attempting, a retired carpenter named Old Abe Pruitt, who showed up one morning without introduction, and took over the door hanging with silent authority. A pair of teenage boys from the north end of town who were mostly in the way but moved lumber faster than anyone. Evie coordinated all of it. She had Thomas's sketch memorized, every room, every dimension, and she held it in her head like a map, directing the work with calm precision, never raising her voice, never asking twice for anything. Will worked beside her, and between them there developed the particular wordless fluency of 2 people who had learned to read each other through labor. He knew when she was tired before she showed it, a slight slowing in her hammer strikes, a set to her shoulders. She knew when he was pushing too hard on his bad shoulder, an old injury, a horse fall from years back, and she'd redirect his task without comment, handing him something that didn't require overhead reach. Nobody said anything about any of this. Nobody had to. But one afternoon, Opal stopped by with food she had taken to bringing lunch, which no one acknowledged as generosity, and everyone accepted as fact. And she watched the 2 of them work for a while, with an expression that could only be described as quiet satisfaction. You know what I see, she said to the preacher's wife, who had come along to help with the food. What? The preacher's wife asked. 2 people who forgot they were allowed to have something again, Opal said, and handed the woman a serving dish. It was 3 weeks before the deadline when Lawrence Donovan came back. Not in the evening this time, and not with hired men. He came in the full morning in his good jacket with the town's land assessor beside him, and 2 council members riding behind all of it, arranged to look official, measured legal. He tied his horse at the edge of the lot and walked toward the cabin with the particular posture of a man who had already decided how this conversation ended. Evie saw him coming. She set down her level, stepped off the half-finished porch, and walked out to meet him in the open ground between the cabin and the road. She didn't wait for him to speak first. Mr. Donovan, she said, I see you've brought company. Mrs. Clarke? He nodded at her, then looked at the cabin with an expression of professional assessment. I wanted the assessor to take a formal look at where things stand. Given the deadline, it seems fair to everyone involved. Fair, she repeated. Just procedure. The assessor, a thin man named Aldous Webb, who had the look of someone deeply uncomfortable with where he'd been placed, opened his notebook and began walking the perimeter of the structure without making eye contact with anyone. Will had come to stand at Evie's left side without discussing it. Not in front of her at her side. She noticed, and she didn't tell him to move. One of the council members, a man named Garrett Cross, cleared his throat. Mrs. Clarke, the council just wants to ensure the deadline is being... What's your definition of livably complete? Evie asked him directly. He blinked. I beg your pardon. The completion statute. What does the territory define as livably complete? I'd like to hear it from you, since you've ridden all the way out here. Cross looked at Donovan. Donovan kept his eyes on Evie, and his expression pleasant. 4 walls, a roof, a functioning door, and a hearth, Webb said from the perimeter without looking up. He said it in the flat voice of a man reciting something he'd read that morning. Then come inside, Evie said. She turned and walked toward the cabin. After a moment, everyone followed. The interior was not finished. She wasn't going to pretend it was. The walls were up and solid. The roof was on, and sealed the stone hearth in the main room was mortared and set. The door hung straight and latched clean. The floor was bare board. There was no furniture except a crate she used as a table and a sleeping roll in the corner. But it was a cabin, real and solid and built by her hands and the hands of people who had chosen to stand with her. Webb walked through it with his notebook measuring, noting, saying nothing. Donovan followed, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. The assessor read them perfectly. Will thought, watching from the doorway. When Webb came back to the main room, he wrote something in his notebook and looked at Donovan. It meets the statute definition, he said quietly. Donovan's pleasant expression didn't move. The hearth hasn't been tested. Smoke capacity. It meets the statute definition. Webb said again, with slightly more emphasis on each word. A silence opened up in the room. Evie stood in the middle of it with her arms at her sides and her face composed and her eyes on Donovan. Well, Donovan said after a moment. He adjusted his jacket. There's still the matter of the original purchase documentation. My attorney has questions about the payment timeline. Your attorney can address those questions to my attorney, Evie said. The room shifted. Everyone in it shifted. Because Evie Clarke, the widow alone on the ridge, the woman who had come to Harlan Creek with nothing, had just said the words my attorney with perfect, unashamed authority. And the implication was clear. She had not been sitting still, and she had not been working only on the cabin. Will had known. He was the one who had ridden to the county seat 3 weeks ago and found George Hallworth, the only attorney in the territory who had a reputation for taking cases against men like Donovan and not losing his nerve halfway through. He had not told Evie he was going. He had just gone and come back and told her what Hallworth said, and she had looked at him with an expression he hadn't been able to read clearly. Something between gratitude and an emotion that had more complicated layers, and she'd said, "How much does he charge?" And Will had said, "We worked something out," and she had said, "You didn't have to do that." And he had said, "I know," and neither of them had addressed what that exchange actually meant. Donovan looked from Evie to Will and back to Evie. The calculation in his eyes was visible, and it wasn't pleasant. "I see," he said. "I expect you do," Evie said. He left. The assessor followed quickly with something that looked very much like relief. The council members stayed a moment longer. Garrett Cross, looking at the interior of the cabin with an expression that had shifted considerably from when he arrived. "This is good work, Mrs. Clarke," Cross said. He meant the cabin, or perhaps he meant more than that. "Thank you," she said. "See yourselves out." After they were gone, Evie sat down on the crate in the main room and pressed both hands flat on her knees and stayed still for a long moment. Will leaned against the doorframe and let her have it. "You went to Hallworth," she said finally. Not an accusation. A statement. 3 weeks ago. "You didn't tell me." "No." She looked up at him. Her eyes held something complicated. Not anger, not relief, Not quite trust, but something in the territory of all three. "Why not?" He took a breath. "Because I didn't want you to tell me not to." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he started to think he'd overstepped, that this was the moment she drew back and reminded him, as she had every right to, that this was her land, her fight, her decision. Instead, she said, "Donovan's not finished." "No," Will said. "He isn't. Whatever he does next will be worse than hired men with axes. Probably. And you're still going to be here." He looked at her. Not a question he was being asked. An observation she was making about him the same way she observed everything directly and without flinching. "I'm still going to be here," he said. Something moved across her face. That crack in the wall, the one that had first appeared the morning Opal showed up with the wagon, shifted open another fraction. She stood up, picked up her level, walked to the far wall where the shelving brackets still needed to go up. "Then stop standing in the doorway," she said. "We've got work to do." He almost smiled again. This time he let it get further. Donovan moved faster than either of them expected. Not with hired men this time. Not with axes in the night or official assessors with notebooks. He moved the way men with money and patience moved when they felt the ground shifting under them quietly through channels, through people. The first Will heard of it was from Tom Hadley's older son, who came to the worksite on a Monday morning with his hat in his hand and an expression that didn't suit him. "There's talk in town," he said. Will kept nailing the shelf bracket. "There's always talk in town. Different kind of talk." He glanced at Evie, who was across the room, fitting a window latch and not looking at them, but Will knew she was listening. She always listened. "About Mrs. Clarke. About—" He stopped, started again. "About why she came here alone. Whether the deed is real, whether her husband—" "I'll stop you there," Will said. He set down the hammer. He turned and looked at Tom's son with the particular stillness of a man deciding exactly how much of himself to show. "Where's this coming from?" "Saloon mostly, but it's spreading." The young man shifted his weight. "People are saying Donovan's attorney found something in the original purchase records. That Thomas Clarke had debts. That the land payment may have come from money that wasn't, that there were questions about where it came from." Will said nothing. "It's not true," Evie said from across the room. Tom's son looked at her. She had turned from the window and was looking at him directly. Her voice was level, but her hand was tight around the window latch. "My husband was a school teacher," she said. "He saved for 4 years to buy this land. He had no debts that weren't settled before he died. I settled them myself. And whoever is saying otherwise is either ignorant or being paid to be." "Yes, ma'am," Tom's son said. "I believe you. I just thought you ought to know what's being said." "I appreciate that," she said, and turned back to the window. Will rode to find George Hallworth that afternoon. The attorney had set up temporary office in the back room of the Harlan Creek post office, the only private space available to rent in town, which said something about both the town and Hallworth's budget. He was a lean, careful man in his late 40s, with ink on his fingers, and the particular focused energy of someone who spent most of his waking hours several moves ahead of everyone in the room. "The debt story," Hallworth said before Will finished explaining. "Yes, Donovan's man has been circulating it for 4 days. I was wondering when it would reach you." "Is there anything to it?" "Not legally. The purchase was clean. I've seen the territorial records, 2 payments, both documented, both receipted. Thomas Clarke paid in full." He laced his fingers. "But legal truth and social truth are 2 different animals, and Donovan knows that better than most. If he can make the town uncertain enough about Evie's character, the council will be more willing to let the claim lapse on a technicality rather than fight Donovan's petition. So he's not fighting her in court," Will said. "He's fighting her in the street. He's fighting her in the minds of 12 men who sit on that council and have to live next to Lawrence Donovan for the rest of their lives." Hallworth looked at him. "There's a town meeting Thursday. Donovan has requested time to present his case to the full council. I'll be there to counter it. But Will—" He paused. "It would help considerably if people who know Evie Clarke stand up and say so, publicly, on the record." Will nodded. "I'll be there." "It may cost you something," Halworth said. "Donovan has a long memory." "I know it," Will said. He told Evie that night, standing outside the cabin in the last of the summer light, and she listened to all of it the way she always did, still and completely. When he finished, she said, "I won't go." He looked at her. "Evie, it's my land and my deed and my name they're dragging through the saloon floor, and I will not sit in a room and listen to Lawrence Donovan perform his version of justice in front of people who already half believe whatever he tells them." Her voice was controlled, but the edges were sharp. "I'll end up saying something that gives his attorney exactly what he needs. You have a right to be there, and Donovan has money and time and a circuit judge in his pocket." She looked at him. "You go. You speak. Halworth speaks. Let the record show what it shows." She turned toward the cabin door. "I'm done letting men like him put me in rooms and ask me to defend my existence." He stood there for a moment, looking at the door she'd stepped through, and something tightened in his chest. Not disagreement. Something closer to fear, the particular fear of watching someone you care about walk a line that's thinner than they realize. He went inside and said, "All right, I'll speak for you." She looked at him from across the room. "Speak the truth," she said. "That's all I need." He nodded. He didn't know yet how complicated that promise was going to be. The Thursday meeting drew the biggest crowd the Harlan Creek Council Hall had seen in 3 years. Word had spread the way. Word always spread in a small town faster than fire and just as indiscriminate, and people came not because they had strong opinions, but because they were curious, and curious people in a small town fill a room. The council sat at the front table. Halworth sat at a separate table to the left, with his papers laid out in precise order. Donovan stood near the front in his good jacket with his attorney beside him, a man named Croft, who had come from the county seat and looked like he'd been specifically grown for small-town intimidation. Will sat 3 rows back with Opal Richardson on one side and Tom Hadley on the other. Croft presented first. He was good at it. Will had to give him that. He laid out the debt allegations with enough vagueness to avoid being provably wrong, and enough specificity to sound authoritative. He questioned Thomas Clarke's financial history with the measured skepticism of a man who had been hired to create doubt, not establish truth. He referenced the completion statute, the petition timeline, the circuit court precedent. He was thorough and unhurried, and Will watched the faces of the council members as he spoke. 3 of them were already decided one way or the other. 4 were watching Donovan, not Croft, which told Will everything about where their loyalties sat. The remaining 5 were the ones that mattered, the ones who were actually listening. Halworth countered everything cleanly and with documentation. The purchase records, the receipts, the registration filing, the 2 witnesses still alive and reachable who had been present at the signing. He was precise and calm, and clearly more prepared than Croft had counted on, and Will saw Croft's rhythm break twice when Halworth produced documents the other man hadn't anticipated. Then Garrett Cross, the council member who had stood in the cabin 2 weeks ago and said it was good work, asked if anyone in the room wanted to speak as a character witness for Evelyn Clarke. Opal stood up immediately. She spoke for 4 minutes in the flat, direct tone she used for everything, and she said exactly what she believed, that Evie Clarke was honest, hard-working, and had asked for nothing from nobody, and that what was happening to her was a transparent attempt by a man with too much money and too little conscience to take a widow's land, and that this council would answer to more than Lawrence Donovan if it let that happen. There was a murmur through the room, not unanimous, but meaningful. Cross looked at Will. "Mr. Mercer, you've been working on the Clarke property." Will stood. And here was the moment, the one Halworth had warned him might cost something. Because Garrett Cross then said, "And can you speak to the nature of your relationship with Mrs. Clarke, given that you've been spending considerable time at her property?" The room shifted. A specific kind of shift, the one that happened when a crowd sensed something private about to be opened up. Will understood immediately what Croft had given Cross to say. It wasn't about character. It was about implication. The question wasn't really about Will's relationship with Evie. It was about making the room wonder if there was a relationship, and making that wonder cast a shadow on everything Opal had just said, and everything Evie's deed represented. It was clever, it was vicious, and it worked the way small-town insinuation always worked, quietly and fast. Will looked at Cross. He felt the weight of the room on him. He felt the particular pressure of Donovan's attention from the front row. And he hesitated. Not for long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in a room that quiet, 3 seconds was a lifetime. "I'm a neighbor," he said finally. "I helped a neighbor build a cabin. That's the extent of it." It was true. Every word of it was true. But the 3 seconds before it sat in the room like a concession, and Will knew it, and he saw Halworth's jaw tighten slightly, and he sat back down with the specific discomfort of a man who has done something he cannot immediately undo. He didn't know Evie had come. She had told him she wouldn't, and he had believed her, and she had meant it when she said it. But she'd lasted until sundown, and then she'd saddled her mule and ridden the 2 miles to town because she needed to know. She had slipped in the back door during Opal's testimony and stood against the wall in the shadows, close enough to hear everything, including the hesitation. She left before the meeting ended. She was back at the cabin by the time Will arrived, and she was inside, and the door was closed, and the lamp was out. He knocked. Nothing. "Evie," he said. The door opened. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not hurt, something colder than both. The expression of a person recalibrating a calculation they thought they'd already made. "You were there," he said. He knew it before he finished the sentence. "You hesitated," she said. "I know. 3 seconds." She said it without accusation. That was somehow worse than if she'd been furious. "I counted." He took his hat off. What Cross was implying if I'd answered it the wrong way, if I'd given them anything to attach to your name. I know exactly what Cross was implying. Her voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "And I know why you answered the way you did. I'm not saying it was wrong, Will. I'm saying it happened." She looked at him. "I'm saying I saw it." "Evie, I trusted you," she said. Not past tense, present. Which was, he realized, more careful than it sounded. Not "I trusted you and now I don't." I trusted you and I felt what it was like when you pulled back from that, even by 3 seconds, even with every good reason in the world. He stood in the doorway and did not try to argue because there was nothing to argue. She was right about what she saw. He had hesitated. He had done it for defensible reasons, and it had still cost her something, and he had to stand there and hold that without trying to make it smaller than it was. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know." She stepped back from the door, not inviting him in, stepping back from the conversation. "Good night, Will." The door closed. He stood outside for a long moment in the dark. Then he walked to his horse. Then he stopped. He turned around and knocked again. She opened it. Her expression said she had expected this and hadn't decided yet how she felt about being right. I should have said, "He told her that you are the most honest person I have met in years, that every day I have watched you build something out of nothing and refuse to let this town, or that man, or bad luck or grief take it from you." That's what I should have said in that room, and I didn't say it because I was thinking about consequences instead of truth, and that's on me and nobody else. He put his hat back on. "That's all. Good night." He turned and walked to his horse. He was 10 steps away when she said, "Will." He stopped. "Halworth thinks we'll hold the claim," she said. "If the council votes honestly." Halworth's usually right. A pause. The kind that has weight to it. "Same time tomorrow." He turned enough to look at her over his shoulder. "Same time tomorrow." She closed the door. But this time the lamp came on inside, and he could see it through the window as he rode away, and it stayed on. The council vote was 3 days later. 6-4 in Evie's favor. It was not the landslide it should have been. 4 men had voted to let Donovan's petition proceed, which meant 4 men had looked at a widow's clean deed and documented payments and the testimony of 2 neighbors who had nothing to gain and voted with their interests instead of their conscience. Harlan Creek was not a perfect town, and the vote made that clear. But 6 was enough. Halworth sent word to the cabin by messenger, a single sentence on a folded paper. The claim holds. Will watched Evie read it. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress and went back to hanging the last window shutter. And she worked for another 20 minutes before she stopped and put both hands flat against the cabin wall and pressed her forehead against the wood. He didn't say anything. He just kept working on the porch rail and let her have it. After a while, she pushed back from the wall and her eyes were dry. Of course they were dry, she was Evelyn Clarke, but her voice when she spoke had something in it he hadn't heard before. Something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, and was maybe the sound of a person setting down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it wasn't part of them. Thomas would have liked this cabin, she said. I think he would have, Will said. She nodded once. Then she picked up her hammer. But then Will would think about the timing of this for a long time. Afterward, he heard a horse on the road, moving fast, too fast for casual riding. He turned. It was Ellis Hadley, Tom's younger son, and his face was wrong. Ellis pulled up at the edge of the lot and looked at Will with an expression that had adrenaline in it, the specific bright-eyed look of a young man who has seen something he was not supposed to see and is now carrying it at a gallop. Webb, Ellis said, breathing hard. Aldous Webb, the assessor. He paused to get the rest of it. He came to see my father an hour ago. Said he needed to talk to someone he trusted. Said Donovan's attorney came to his office last night. Offered him money to amend his assessment report. Change the cabin's completion status. He looked from Will to Evie. Webb said no, and then Croft told him that was a disappointing answer. The clearing went very quiet. Where is Webb now? Will asked. At my father's house. Scared. Evie set down her hammer. She stood with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and her face had gone through several things in rapid succession and come out the other side of all of them looking like iron. Donovan just tried to bribe a territorial official, she said. Yes, ma'am, Ellis said. She looked at Will. He looked back at her. Halworth, they said at the same time. Go, she said. He was already moving. Halworth didn't waste a single word when Will arrived. He listened to Ellis Hadley's account with his pen already moving, taking notes in the tight, economical handwriting of a man who understood that what he was hearing was not gossip, but evidence. When Ellis finished, Halworth set the pen down and looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. Bribery of a territorial assessor, he said, is a criminal offense under the 1871 Territorial Code. Not a civil matter, not a land dispute, criminal. He looked at Will. If Webb will testify in writing on record, Donovan's petition doesn't just fail. Donovan faces prosecution. Webb's scared, Will said. Webb should be. Donovan doesn't make idle threats. Halworth stood and reached for his coat. But scared men testify when they understand the alternative is worse than the thing they're afraid of. Right now, Webb is sitting in Tom Hadley's house thinking he's in danger if he talks. I need him to understand he's in far greater danger if he doesn't. He looked at Will. Take me to him. They rode hard. Tom Hadley's house was a solid 2-story on the north edge of town, and when they arrived, Tom himself was on the porch, with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had taken on someone else's problem and was committed to it now, regardless of the cost. He's inside, Tom said. He's been sick twice. Nerves. Halworth went straight in. Will followed. Aldous Webb was at the kitchen table. A slight man who looked considerably slighter than usual, with the gray, hollow look of someone who had spent the last several hours thoroughly understanding his own vulnerability. He looked up when they came in, and the hope and fear in his face arrived simultaneously. Mr. Halworth, he said. Tell me exactly what Croft said to you, Halworth said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Every word in the order he said them. Webb told it. He was precise. Will gave him that. Whatever else the man was, he had a good memory and the instinct to preserve detail, and he laid out the entire conversation with Croft in the careful sequence of a man who had been replaying it compulsively since it happened. The offer. The amount $300, which was more than Webb made in 6 months. The framing of it as a simple clerical correction. And then when Webb had said no, Croft's final statement delivered in the pleasant voice of a man who never raised it that Webb's assessor license was issued annually by the territorial board, and that men on that board were not immune to the opinions of influential community members. When Webb finished, Halworth looked at him for a long moment. "You said no," Halworth said. "I said no. And you came to Tom Hadley rather than disappearing." Webb's jaw moved. "I have a wife. 2 daughters. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not the kind of man who does what Croft wanted. I know how I look right now. I know I look scared. I am scared. But I'm not—" He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I'm not that kind of man." Something in the room settled. Will felt it, and he saw Halworth feel it too. "Then, here's what we're going to do," Halworth said. "You are going to write down everything you just told me, sign it, and I am going to take it to the territorial marshal's office in the county seat. Donovan's attorney will be facing charges by the end of the week. Donovan himself is exposed depending on how much direction he gave Croft." He leaned forward slightly. "You will be protected because you are the witness, Webb, not the defendant. The witness. And witnesses who come forward early and voluntarily are treated very differently from people who wait." Webb looked at him. "You're certain?" "I'm certain that doing nothing guarantees the worst outcome for everyone except Lawrence Donovan. And I'm certain that you've already made the harder choice by coming here instead of taking the money." Halworth set a blank sheet of paper in front of him and placed his pen beside it. "Write it down." Webb picked up the pen. Will was outside on Tom's porch when the door opened behind him, and Tom came out and stood beside him in silence for a moment. "You know Donovan will find out," Tom said. "Before the marshal gets here. Somebody always talks." "I know. And his hired men are still in town." Will had not forgotten this. "I know that too." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Evie's at the cabin alone." Will was already turning for his horse. He rode back at a pace that wasn't casual, and the summer dark was coming down fast, and he pushed Greer harder than he usually did, and the horse responded without complaint, and when the clearing came into sight, and the lamp was on in the cabin window, Will let out a breath he'd been holding for 3 miles. He dismounted and knocked. "It's me," he said. The door opened, and Evie looked at him, read his face in the way she'd learned to read it over these weeks, and said, "What happened?" He told her. All of it. Webb's written statement, Halworth's plan, the marshal, the timeline. She listened without moving from the doorway, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Tom's right. Donovan will know before morning." "Yes. His men are still here. Ellis and Tom are coming. They'll be here by midnight. I'm staying until they arrive." He paused. "If that's all right." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He hadn't been inside the cabin at night before. There had always been a boundary unspoken, but observed between the working hours and the private ones. The interior was spare and clean, the way Evie did everything: a crate table. 2 stools she'd built herself from scrap lumber. The sleeping roll moved to what would eventually be the bedroom corner. A row of hooks on the wall, where her tools hung in precise order. On the crate table was the envelope, Thomas's envelope with the cabin sketch on the back, worn soft at the folds from handling. Will looked at it and looked away. Evie put water on the hearth, and they sat, and for a while neither of them said anything, which had always been one of the easier things between them. Then she said, "Tell me something about Margaret." He looked at her. "You know things about Thomas," she said quietly. "I've told you. It only seems fair." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "She laughed at things other people didn't think were funny. Small things. The way a chicken moved. The sound of a word said wrong. She had this laugh that was— He stopped. It surprised you every time, even when you expected it. Evie was watching him. She would have finished this cabin in half the time, he said. And it would have looked better. He said it without grief, just as a fact, the kind of fact that had passed through pain so many times, it had come out the other side simply true. She was good at building things. So are you, Evie said. He looked at her. You've been here every morning for 2 months, she said. You think I haven't noticed what kind of man that makes you? He didn't answer right away. The fire in the hearth was low and steady, and the summer night outside was full of cricket sound and the distant movement of horses. Tom and Ellis arriving earlier than expected, their voices low on the perimeter. I haven't been good at much since she died, Will said. I've been— He looked for the word— present, going through the motions of being a man. Feeding the cattle, paying the hands, riding the same trail every morning, because I didn't know what else to do with my body. He looked at the fire. And then, I came around that bend. And there you were, dragging logs in the July heat, with nobody to help you, and no intention of stopping, and something in me— He paused. Woke up, I suppose. I don't have a better word for it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when something has been said that needed saying, and both people in the room are deciding what it means. I'm not an easy person, Evie said. I noticed. I don't ask for help and I don't accept it gracefully, and I have very specific opinions about how things should be done. I noticed all of that too. She looked at him. I'm telling you this because I think you should know what you're— She stopped, reconsidered. I think you should have accurate information. He almost smiled. It was such an Evie way to say it, practical and careful and honest, to the edge of self-exposure. Accurate information, he repeated. Yes, all right. He looked at her steadily. I'm a man who doesn't talk much and has a bad shoulder and spent 14 months forgetting how to be in the world. I own land that's been running itself mostly on the strength of 2 good hands I pay fairly. I'm not easy either. But I show up. He said the last 3 words without emphasis, which somehow gave them more weight than if he'd tried to make them into something larger. Whatever I say I'll do, I do. That's the only thing I can promise anybody. Evie held his gaze for a long moment. That, she said quietly, is not a small thing. Outside, Tom Hadley's voice said something low and Ellis laughed, and the ordinary nighttime sounds of 2 men settling in for a watch came through the walls. Safe sounds, present sounds. Evie stood and went to the door and opened it and said goodnight to Tom and Ellis, and then came back and looked at Will. You should sleep, she said. You've got a long ride to the county seat tomorrow. He looked at her. I'm going. Halworth needs someone to ride with him. Webb can't. He's too visible. Tom needs to stay here. She sat back down on her stool with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who had already thought it through. You're the one Halworth trusts, and you can handle the ride. So yes, you're going. He almost said he didn't want to leave her here. He stopped himself because she would find that condescending, and she would be right. Instead, he said, Tom and Ellis are capable men, she said. And I have a rifle, and I know how to use it, which you also already know. She looked at him evenly. I'll be here when you get back. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, All right. She handed him a folded blanket from the shelf. He looked at it. The porch, she said. There's room. He took the blanket and went to the porch. He was asleep in 10 minutes for the first time in longer than he could remember, with the sound of Tom Hadley's low voice on the perimeter and the lamp still on inside the cabin, and he slept without dreaming of Margaret, which was not a betrayal. It was something else entirely, something that didn't have a name yet, but was moving toward one. The ride to the county seat took 7 hours at a steady pace. Halworth talked through the case the entire way, not out of nerves, but out of precision. He was a man who thought best out loud, and Will was content to listen and ask the occasional question that moved things forward. Webb's written statement was in Hallworth's saddlebag, signed and witnessed by Tom Hadley. It was, Hallworth said, about as clean a piece of evidence as he'd seen in a criminal matter in 10 years of practice. "The marshal will want to move quickly," Hallworth said, "before Donovan can get word to anyone at the territorial board. Croft is the more exposed party. He was the one who made the offer directly, but the amount, $300, and the specificity of the threat suggests this came from Donovan, and Croft was executing instruction, not improvising." "Can you prove that?" Will asked. "I can make it the far more probable interpretation of the evidence, and let a jury decide," Hallworth said. "Which in this case amounts to the same thing. Donovan has made enemies. Juries in this territory are not composed of Lawrence Donovan's friends. They arrived at the county seat by mid-afternoon, and the meeting with the marshal took less time than Will expected. Marshal Ira Stokes was a compact, deliberate man who read Webb's statement twice, asked 4 precise questions, and then looked at Hallworth and said, "I'll have a man in Harlan Creek by nightfall." "2 men," Hallworth said. "Donovan employs 3 hired men currently in town who were involved in a property sabotage incident 3 weeks ago." Stokes wrote something down. 2 men. They rode back faster than they'd come. Will arrived at the cabin in the last hour of daylight. Evie was on the porch. She stood when she heard Greer on the ridge trail and watched him come down into the clearing, and he could read her face from 50 yards, the controlled tension in it, and the way it shifted when she saw he was alone and unhurried. "It's done," she asked as he dismounted. "Marshal Stokes is sending 2 men tonight. Donovan will be served with a criminal complaint by morning." He tied Greer to the post. "Croft is already gone. Hallworth thinks he left as soon as Webb disappeared from the tannery without explanation. But Donovan is still in town." She was quiet, processing. "It's not over," Will said. "The land claim is secure, but the criminal matter will take months. Donovan will have a defense. It'll be complicated." "But the land is mine. The land is yours." She nodded once. Slow, deliberate. The nod of a woman filing a fact in its correct place. Then Tom Hadley came around the side of the cabin with Ellis behind him, and Tom said, "Heard the whole thing from the Ridge Sound carries in the evening." He looked at Will with the satisfied expression of a man whose instincts had been correct. "Marshal Stokes is a good man. Donovan picked the wrong widow." "He did," Will agreed. Evie looked at Tom with the expression she used when she was grateful and didn't know a graceful way to say it. "Tom," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Just invite us to supper sometime when you've got a proper table in there." She almost laughed. Almost. But it reached her eyes and Will saw it, and it was, he thought, the most unguarded expression he had seen on her face in 2 months. "I'll hold you to that," she said. Tom and Ellis rode out, and Will was moving to follow when Evie said, "Stay." He stopped. She was looking at him with the direct, clear gaze she used when she'd made a decision and wasn't going to revisit it. "Have supper. There's enough." He secured Greer properly and came inside. They ate at the crate table on the 2 stools she'd built herself, and she had made something simple from what she had, and it was the first time they had sat across from each other and eaten in 2 months of working side by side. There was something about the plainness of it, the bare table, the tin plates, the summer dark coming through the open door, that felt more intimate than anything they'd said to each other. Halfway through the meal, she said, "What happens to you now?" He looked up. "What did you mean?" "The cabin's finished. The claim is secure. The marshal is handling Donovan." She held his gaze. "You don't need to come back every morning anymore." He set down his fork. He understood this was not a dismissal. It was a question. Evie Clarke's way of asking a direct thing without quite asking it directly, which was, he had learned, as close as she got to showing her hand. "Do you want me to stop coming?" he asked. She considered this for a moment with the care she gave everything. "No," she said, simply and without qualification. "No. Not. I suppose not. Not if you want to. Not. I don't have a strong opinion. Just no." He picked his fork back up. "Then I'll keep coming." She nodded and went back to eating, and the simplicity of the exchange was, he thought exactly right. Nothing overstated, nothing underdone. Just the truth of it between two people who had learned over 2 months that the truth was the only language either of them fully trusted. He was standing to leave hat in hand when they heard the horses. Not Tom, not Ellis. The wrong direction, the wrong pace. Coming fast from the south road, 2 horses at minimum, and the sound of them didn't have the relaxed rhythm of men going somewhere for good reasons. Evie was at the window before he reached the door. "Donovan," she said. Her voice was flat and certain. Will had his hand on the door handle. "Stay inside." "Will, Evie." He turned and looked at her, and something in his face made her stop. "I know what I'm doing. Stay inside." He went out. Lawrence Donovan was in the clearing on horseback, and he was not alone. The 2 remaining hired men were behind him, and Donovan's face in the evening light had shed every layer of pleasant performance. What was underneath was not rage, it was colder than rage. It was the face of a man who had spent his life taking what he wanted, and was confronting for the first time in a very long while the possibility that this particular thing was beyond his reach. "Mercer," Donovan said. "You need to turn those horses around," Will said. He was standing in the space between the cabin door and the clearing with his hands at his sides and his voice completely level. "Marshal Stokes has 2 men arriving in Harlan Creek tonight. Whatever you came here thinking you were going to do, you need to think about it being the last decision you make as a free man." Donovan looked at him for a long moment. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "I've got a pretty good idea," Will said. "Go home, Lawrence." The 2 hired men exchanged a look. They were calculating, Will could see it, calculating the math of the situation, which had changed considerably since the marshal entered the equation. And then the cabin door opened behind him. Evie came out. She stood beside Will with her rifle in her hands, not raised, just held. And the message of it was not threat, so much as statement. She looked at Lawrence Donovan with the expression of a woman who had dragged logs in the July heat alone for 11 weeks, while an entire town looked away, who had built a home with her own hands out of a dead man's dream, who had been lied about and maneuvered against, and had stood in front of a council room and let her name be used as a bargaining chip, and who was still here, still standing, still holding her ground. "You picked the wrong 40 acres, she said. Donovan looked at her for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes. Not conscience, not exactly, but the particular shift that happens in a man who has run a calculation and found it doesn't come out the way he planned. He pulled his horse around. The 2 hired men followed without a word. Will and Evie stood side by side in the clearing and watched them go until the sound of the horses faded entirely into the dark. Then Evie let out a long, slow breath. Just one. Then she squared her shoulders and looked at the cabin behind them, solid and real and entirely hers, and she said, "I told you to stay inside." "I know," Will said. She looked at him sideways. "Next time listen." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, dry and warm and entirely without irony, that made her press her lips together against something that was not quite a smile, but was gaining on one fast. They went back inside, and she bolted the door, and the lamp burned low. And outside on the summer dark the crickets were going, and somewhere down the ridge the creek ran clean over its stones, and in the morning the marshal's men would arrive, and Donovan's hired men would be gone by dawn, and the 40 acres would still be hers, and Will Mercer would ride back down the trail and then by the following morning back up it again. But there was one thing he didn't know yet. One thing that would change everything. It was sitting in Hallworth's saddlebag, a second document, one the attorney hadn't mentioned on the ride. A letter from the Territorial Land Office received the previous week, forwarded by a clerk in the county seat who had been cross-referencing deed registrations as part of a routine audit. Thomas Clark's original deed had a co-signatory, a name neither Evie nor Will had ever heard, and that name had filed a competing claim 3 months ago. Hallworth came at dawn. He didn't knock the way a man did when he had good news. He knocked the way a man did when he was carrying something he wished he didn't have to deliver, and Evie heard it before she was fully awake and knew the way she had learned to know things in the past months that the morning was going to require everything she had. She opened the door. Halworth stood there with his hat in both hands and a sealed letter, and an expression that had rearranged itself into careful neutrality, which was she had come to understand his version of bracing himself. "I need you to sit down," he said. "Tell me standing," she said. He told her. She didn't move while he spoke. Not a muscle. She stood in the doorway of the cabin she had built with her own hands and listened to George Halworth explain that the Territorial Land Office had flagged a co-signatory on the original deed, a name one, Ezra Whitfield, listed as a financial guarantor on the purchase agreement Thomas Clarke had filed in January of 1872. And that Ezra Whitfield had submitted a competing land claim to the Territorial Office 3 months ago, citing his status as guarantor and Thomas Clarke's death as grounds for reverting partial ownership. When Halworth finished, the silence was complete. Then Evie said, "Thomas never mentioned an Ezra Whitfield." "No," Halworth said. "I didn't think he had." "Who is he?" "That," Halworth said carefully, "is what concerns me most. Because I spent last evening making inquiries, and Ezra Whitfield is a property broker out of Billings. He has no personal connection to Thomas Clarke that I can find. No friendship, no family relation, no business partnership of record." He paused. "But he does have a documented professional relationship with Lawrence Donovan going back 7 years. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Evie's jaw tightened. "Donovan found a man to sign Thomas's deed." "I believe so. Whether it happened before or after Thomas died, I can't yet determine. But a guarantor signature on a land deed can be added after the primary filing in certain circumstances, and the Territorial Office in 1872 was not," he chose the word with care, "rigorous in its verification practices. So Donovan had someone fraudulently insert a name into my husband's deed," Evie said, "and then waited 2 years, and then used that name to file a competing claim at the exact moment I was fighting his other petition." "That is my working theory," Halworth said. "Yes." She was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Then, can you prove it?" "Not yet, but Webb's testimony about Croft's bribery attempt gives us substantial leverage. And if Whitfield himself can be reached, where is he? Billings, 4 days' ride." The door behind Evie opened, and Will came out, having heard the last portion of the conversation through the cabin wall. He looked at Halworth, then at Evie. "I'll go," he said. She turned on him fast. "No. Evie, you've already ridden to the county seat, stayed up half the night, and ridden back. You're not riding 4 days to Billings." She turned back to Halworth. "There has to be another way." "There may be," Halworth said. "If I can get a deposition from Whitfield's clerk, anyone in his office who was present when the guarantor paperwork was prepared, I can establish whether the signature was obtained fraudulently without requiring Whitfield's cooperation. It's slower, but it doesn't require a 4-day ride." "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Evie absorbed this. "And in the meantime, the competing claim is stayed pending the criminal investigation into Donovan. The marshal's filing this morning creates a legal hold on any related property actions. You're not in immediate danger of losing anything." He held her gaze. "But Evie, I need you to understand that this is not the last move Donovan will make. He has more resources than you and more time than you, and he is willing to do things that you are not. This fight may go on." "I know that," she said. "And you're prepared to keep fighting it." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Halworth, I built that cabin by myself in the Montana summer with a rifle in reach and a deed in my pocket and an entire town that wouldn't look me in the eye. I have been prepared for things to be difficult since before I arrived in Harlan Creek." She paused. "What I was not prepared for was people choosing to stand with me. That part still surprises me." She glanced at Will, quick and unguarded, and looked back at Halworth. "The fighting part, I know how to do. Just tell me what you need." Halworth looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his estimate of someone upward. I need whatever correspondence you have from Thomas. Letters, records, anything that mentions the land. Purchase the payment, any names he referenced in connection with the deal. I have his letters, she said. I have all of them. Then I need to read them. She went inside and came back with a bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with a piece of twine worn at the edges, the way things got worn when they were handled often. She handed them to Halworth, and he took them with both hands and the particular care of a man who understood he was being given something irreplaceable. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. Find me Ezra Whitfield, she said, and let me know what Thomas told him. Halworth left. Will stayed. He leaned against the porch rail and watched Evie stand in the middle of the lot with her arms crossed and her eyes on something far away, and he let her have a full minute before he said, You should eat something. I'm not hungry. That's not what I asked. She turned and looked at him with the expression she used when she found him simultaneously useful and irritating. Then she went inside and he followed, and she put water on, and they sat across from each other at the crate table, and she said, He's not going to stop. No. Even with the criminal charges, even with Webb's testimony, men like Donovan, they don't stop. They find new angles. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I've built this cabin, and I've held this land, and I will hold it until I can't anymore. But I need to know. She stopped. He waited. She looked at him directly. I need to know who is still here when it gets harder. Not because I'm asking you to stay, but because I can't. Her voice was steady, but he heard something underneath it that she was managing carefully. I cannot build something again and have it come apart. I can fight Donovan. I can fight the county and the territorial court and every man Donovan puts in a suit and sends my direction. What I cannot do is be wrong about the people I let in. Will was quiet for a moment. He understood exactly what she was asking, and he understood that she had not asked it lightly, that Evelyn Clarke, who asked for nothing and accepted less, was asking him to be certain in a way she could rely on. I'm here, he said. Not because the cabin needs finishing or because Donovan needs stopping. Because I come down that ridge every morning, and this is where I want to be. He held her gaze. I was wrong about a lot of things after Margaret died. One of the things I was wrong about was that I didn't deserve to want anything anymore. He paused. I'm done being wrong about that. The room held very still. Then Evie unfolded her hands and picked up her tin cup and said, All right, in a voice that was quiet and settled and entirely certain, and it was the most complete answer she could have given him. Halworth's clerk found the first thread 4 days later. It came in the form of a letter routed through the post office addressed to Halworth from a land records assistant in Billings named Carver, who had, upon discreet inquiry from Halworth's associate, found something in the deed filing records that had been bothering him for 2 years. Halworth came to the cabin and read it aloud. The guarantor line on Thomas Clarke's deed had been added 14 months after the original filing, not at signing, after. The amendment was dated September of 1873, 5 months after Thomas died. Carver had flagged it as a clerical irregularity at the time, and been told by his supervisor to note it and move on. Ezra Whitfield had never met Thomas Clarke. Because Thomas Clarke had been dead for 5 months when his signature was placed on that amendment. The room was very quiet. Then Evie said, They forged Thomas's signature. On an amendment to a deed, Halworth said, which established Whitfield as guarantor, which Whitfield then used whether knowingly or at Donovan's instruction to file a competing claim. He set the letter down. This is not a property dispute anymore. This is fraud, document fraud, on a territorial deed. Can Carver testify? Will asked. Carver has already written to the marshal's office directly, Halworth said. He didn't wait for me to ask. Apparently, it's been on his conscience for 2 years. He looked at Evie. Evie, this is over. Not the legal process that will take months, but the substance of it. Donovan has committed fraud against a widow using a forged dead man's signature, and there is now a paper trail that leads directly to him and a territorial records clerk willing to speak to it. He said it plainly without drama because that was Halworth's way. He cannot win this. Not anymore. Evie sat with that for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, the envelope, the sketch, the 4 years of saving. She thought about the letters now sitting in Halworth's office. Thomas's handwriting describing a piece of land in Montana as the place where they'd build something real. She thought about the fact that someone had put Thomas's name on a document 5 months after he was dead and buried in service of taking the thing he'd saved for the thing he'd left her, the thing she'd come all this way to hold. Her hands were completely still on the table. Her face was composed. "Thomas paid for this land in full," she said. "He saved 4 years. He signed a clean deed with 2 witnesses. He never heard of Ezra Whitfield or Lawrence Donovan." She paused. "And someone sat down with a pen and wrote his name on a piece of paper after he was already in the ground." "Yes," Halworth said. "Then I want every person whose name is on that amendment held to account," she said. "Not just for my land, for his name." The arrest came 6 days later. Not Donovan himself, not yet. Croft first brought in from where he'd fled to the next county, found at a boarding house by 2 of Marshal Stokes's men, and transported back to Harlan Creek in visible public custody on a Tuesday morning. The town saw it. The town was meant to see it. Evie was at the general store when the wagon came through, and she stood on the boardwalk with Opal Richardson beside her and watched Croft go by, and she didn't say anything, and neither did Opal, and that was enough. Whitfield's attorney contacted Halworth 3 days after Croft's arrest and offered a full written statement in exchange for reduced exposure. The statement named Donovan as the architect of every element of the scheme. The forged amendment, the fraudulent competing claim, the bribery attempt on Webb, and the original hired men who had torn down Evie's roof framing on a Friday night in July. Donovan was arrested on a Thursday. He didn't come out of his house easily. There was a period of about 40 minutes during which the marshal's men stood at his front door and waited, and the town gathered at a respectful but interested distance, and nothing moved except a curtain in a front window. And then the door opened, and Lawrence Donovan came out in his good jacket, the same one he'd worn to every council meeting and every intimidation visit to Evie's clearing, and he walked to the marshal's wagon with the rigid posture of a man determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him diminished. He passed within 20 feet of Will Mercer, who was standing at the edge of the crowd. He did not look at Will. He looked straight ahead. Will watched him go. He felt nothing dramatic, no triumph, no satisfaction, nothing that made a sound inside him. Just the quiet settling of something that had been in the wrong place for a long time, finally returning to where it belonged. Halworth came to the cabin that evening with a bottle of something he'd been keeping for an occasion, and Tom Hadley came, and Ellis came, and old Abe Pruitt, who had hung the cabin door without introduction, showed up with his wife, and Opal came, and took over the management of the gathering, with the authority she brought to everything. And for the first time since April, the cabin was full of people who had chosen to be there, not because there was work to do, but because there was something to celebrate. It was not a large party. It was a small one, which suited the cabin and the people in it. At some point in the evening, Opal caught Will at the edge of the room and said quietly, "She's going to be all right, you know." "I know," he said. "I meant even without all of this." Opal nodded in Evie's direction. Across the room, Evie was in conversation with Abe Pruitt's wife, and she was not quite smiling, but she was listening with her full attention in the way she did when she was genuinely interested in a person. She was going to be all right regardless. She didn't need you to save her. "I know that too," Will said. "Good." Opal looked at him. Then what did she need? He thought about it for a moment. "Someone to show up," he said. "Every morning, without being asked." Opal made the sound she made when something confirmed what she already believed. "And what did you need?" He looked at Evie across the room. "Same thing," he said. Opal patted his arm once, which from Opal Richardson was the equivalent of a standing ovation, and went to find someone who needed more food. Later. After everyone had gone and the cabin was quiet, Evie washed the tin cups at the basin, and Will stacked the stools against the wall, and it was the ordinary domestic rhythm of two people at the end of an evening unremarkable and entirely remarkable at once. When she set the last cup down, she turned and leaned against the basin and looked at him with the direct gaze she used when she'd made a decision and was ready to say it out loud. "I want to tell you something," she said. He stopped and looked at her. "When I came to Harlan Creek," she said, "I was not—" She chose the words the way she chose everything, with precision. "I was not expecting anything from anyone. I had a deed and a wagon and Thomas's sketch and the understanding that this would be something I did alone. That was fine. I had done alone before." She paused. "And then you rode down that ridge and stood between me and Lawrence Donovan without being asked and without wanting anything, and I thought I was careful to think that it was just decency. That you were a decent man doing a decent thing, and I should not attach more to it than that." Will waited. "I was wrong," she said. "Not about the decency. About the more than that." He crossed the room and stood in front of her close enough that this was a decision they were both making, and he said, "I have not been certain of many things since Margaret died. I have been certain of about 3. He held her gaze. "You are one of them." She reached up and put one hand flat against his chest. Not dramatic, not performance, just the gesture of a woman testing something real and finding it solid, and she looked at him and said, "Then stay." He covered her hand with his. "I was never leaving," he said. The territorial court finalized Evie's deed claim 11 weeks later, in late October of 1874. Donovan's criminal trial ran through the winter and into the following spring. He was convicted on 3 counts, including fraud on a territorial document and conspiracy to commit bribery. Croft received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Ezra Whitfield, who had signed his name to a dead man's amendment for $400, lost his broker's license and was assessed a civil judgment he spent years paying off. The competing claim was voided in its entirety. The 40 acres on the ridge above Harlan Creek, with the creek below and the summer heat and the cabin built one log at a time, by a woman with bandaged hands and a dead man's dream, remained exactly what it had always been hers. Opal Richardson told anyone who asked that she had known from the first morning she brought food to the worksite how it would end. Not the Donovan part, which was satisfying but not surprising, but the other part. The part where 2 people, who had each spent a year forgetting they were allowed to have something, found each other over raw lumber and summer heat, and the particular stubbornness of not giving up. Some people, Opal said, are too tired to hope, and some people, she said, looking across the feed store counter with the expression of a woman who had watched enough of human nature to know what she was talking about, are just tired enough to finally let something real in. Will Mercer rode the Ridge Trail every morning for the rest of his life, but after the autumn of 1874, he never rode it alone. And Evelyn Clarke, who had come to Harlan Creek with nothing but a deed and a dream and a fury she had nowhere else to put, built the life Thomas had imagined on the land Thomas had paid for with her own hands and her own heart and on her own terms. Not because anyone gave it to her, because she refused to let anyone take it. That is the only kind of beginning worth having. The kind you fight for yourself with the people who chose to stand beside you on ground that is yours because you were willing to hold it.